Hello. So as you know, I am Meg, Head of People Operations here at Fishtown Analytics, and I'm so excited to chat with you all today and for this panel. This topic is, of course, near and dear to my heart. There are so many reasons that building diverse data teams is the right approach, but it's definitely not always the easy road to take when building a company. This is why I feel so lucky to work for an organization that truly believes it's a top priority. And the three women on this panel not only share that passion, they have some excellent insights, and our objective over the next 50 minutes is for you to walk away with some changes or additions you can incorporate into your hiring process to continue to focus on building a diverse team. So with that, I'd love to introduce our wonderful panelists. All can share your favorite interview questions. We'll start with Colleen.
Hi, I'm Colleen Tartow, Director of Engineering at Starburst Data. My favorite interview question is actually one that I love because it tests a lot about communication, and it's teach me something in 3 minutes. So it's basically, it can be anything you want, but I need you to teach me something new in 3 minutes. And so that's what I ask, and I'm giving away all my secrets, but there you go.
That's what we're here for, right?
Yeah.
Ilse?
Yeah, I would say I don't actually have a favorite question. I want to make sure that my questions are very tied to the actual skill that the person needs for the job. And so I don't have like a kind of standard go-to or kind of surprise question that I throw in there.
What about you, Alexis?
Well, I get to cheat a little bit because we don't decide ours arbitrarily. Also, because I work with Ilse, we set up that process together. I always think it's fun to hear the answers from candidates about what something is that they learned recently or why they decided to pick it up. But yeah, the interview questions, I don't know, they're useful, but I've never come across a favorite. I have to say that.
Okay, great. So we're here to talk about building diverse data teams and inclusion in the hiring process. Let's start with the what and the why, right? What better place to start? So why should there be a focus on inclusion in the hiring process? And then a two-part question: how would you generate buy-in, especially when folks might see it more as a checkbox than an actual business need? Anyone want to jump in there?
I can. So to me, the main reason is fairness. And I think focusing on inclusion in the hiring process itself is particularly important because there's so many steps in the process. And so a little bias at each step ends up compounding over the whole process and can end up with a very unfair result. And I'm assuming fairness is a quality we all care about, but if you're also having to make kind of the business case for it with your HR team or leadership, it also makes good business sense because you end up with a much better outcome, like higher quality candidates and hires. And that's because you're getting a broader pool of candidates. So you're not like inadvertently excluding great candidates. And then you're also screening on the right things for the job, like as opposed to what college they went to, which might just be an indicator of a privileged background. And so you end up with candidates that are better suited to the job.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would add that to me, diversity is paramount, and hiring a diverse team means that you're looking at people from all different backgrounds, and really having an inclusive process and an inclusive culture at your company indicates that you're committed to providing a process where a person's background doesn't affect the outcome, and that you're truly, valuing what makes that person special and allowing them to shine throughout the process and really show you who they are. And then you can really make the decision, does this person fit with what we're looking for or not? And so, as Ilse said, like having that inclusive process allows you to, address any biases you might have, and then not limiting your ability to really embrace diversity in your employee workplace.
And Ilse, you had mentioned education. I think a lot of people might think of diversity as diversity you can physically see. That's not always the case. So how do you go and define diversity? How do you go about starting that process?
I mean, I think there are signals in your job description that you welcome a diversity of applicants. And then there's also like at the top of your recruiting funnel, making sure that you're advertising broadly, and also it's worth it to pay to post in underrepresented groups. And then also not relying on network for referrals, for candidate referrals, because that ends up creating more of a like group.
Yeah. Great. Alexis, any tips there?
I think I've experienced a lot of what Ilse talked about as far as a process being intentionally designed. So we work together at Brooklyn Data, but we also work together at my last company. And that's where I saw what our candidates see here now is you get really good signals about the direction a company is going from the very first thing you read, which is typically that job description, if you haven't met someone at a meetup or something like that. So no company is perfect. Everyone's growing, but it's always a really good sign when a job description is thoughtfully worded, when people are available to answer questions like, what is it really like? I get a lot of candidates who will reach out to me and ask, like, really, how does the company think about it? And so that's a part of not necessarily the specific steps that we put in the process, but it's a part of being available and not just projecting that we do a good job from the hiring process on, but also actually doing it. But yeah, I noticed it from the beginning, and we definitely get comments from our candidates all the time that regardless of what y'all think, I really appreciate. I appreciate the job description. I appreciate the experience of how thoughtfully you've considered all the different types of people who can apply. So it's the right thing to do, and it shows.
Yeah, I think Ilse also touched on something like sourcing and making sure that you're not just hiring referrals. I mean, as a hiring manager, if somebody's like, oh, my best friend has all of the things you're looking for and would do great, like it's tempting to just, look at that person. But like Ilse said, like you don't end up with diversity of thought that way. And so really thinking outside the box as far as, maybe, I think people no longer put, education on their job descriptions. I think that's a common thing to drop these days. But I think it's become apparent that it doesn't matter. Like some of the greatest minds of this generation haven't had college degrees. And so, just taking that one step further and really thinking outside the box, but then also sponsoring organizations that, allow you access to candidates who might not have otherwise heard of you, or you might not otherwise have access to outside of referrals is really important. And really putting your money where your mouth is and paying to sponsor those events and go to those events is key.
Yeah. I'll put you all on the spot right now. If you had to pick your favorite place to sponsor, your favorite place to post a job where you're going to generate a diverse pipeline, where would that be?
Oh, the Diversity Tech Co board and newsletter. I knew the person through our DC Tech Meetup circles who runs that. Her name is Veni Kunchi. It's a great newsletter for anyone who's listening who's wondering, how do I grow my knowledge about people who are different from me? But she's also got a great board that's really catered towards making sure that everyone can see things from different companies, and it has a clear focus on how the different companies support people of diverse backgrounds when they join, so that it starts to get folks thinking about hiring outside of just the box ticking exercise.
Yeah,
so
totally echo diversified tech.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got to that one. I have a few others. I like She Geeks Out. It's a group here in Boston that I think is also in San Francisco and New York, and they've been a great partner for me, and I found some really wonderful candidates through that as well. But there's a lot of like women in tech and tech women and
people of color in tech is another good one. I think we've got a list. Yeah, we could. Oh, Techeria is great too. Lots of great folks over there. We could share our list out afterwards.
Absolutely. In that Slack channel. Let's do it. All right. So we talked about where to find these people and how to get more diverse folks in the funnel. What about the applicants though? You don't want to forget that there are still people finding jobs and applying to them. And how do you eliminate bias when it comes to application review and the folks that are actually looking at those resumes?
I think you need to be broad in what you're looking for, because a couple of things, just because somebody hasn't done something specific that you're thinking your person needs to do doesn't mean they can't. So being really broad and talking to a wide array of people. I also, obviously try not to look at a person's name. I mean, there's ways to make resumes blind, and, not looking at their education, I think, is key. But like really just setting a expectation that, you're looking for a specific set of skills as the base, and then being really broad in your definition of what they've done with those skills.
Yeah, for every element of our hiring funnel at Brooklyn Data, so we have people answer questions for their application. There's a screening call. There's a technical exercise. There's a panel interview, and every step we put a rubric that matches up to our company values and what people need to do to be successful to the job. And anytime we think about adding something in or taking something out, we always ask, does this actually relate to that? Because you can't totally eliminate bias, but you can do everything you can to control for it. And so having that background, or having that to come back to, like, do I just not like this, or is it actually something that will stop this person from being successful? Like, that's a really critical question for I mean, every touch point hiring through, a person being successful at the job, but definitely important in the application process as well.
And then taking the pains also to anonymize applications just for that implicit bias early on in the process. In our applicant tracking system, I'm surprised by how few applicant tracking systems provide that or accommodate it. So we do it totally manually, where PeopleOps comes in and anonymizes the applicants, and then we go in and review them. And then they get de-anonymized later when we need to reach out and communicate with them. But another small but I think important element is also rating the candidates separately. So each reviewer rating them without seeing someone else's review, because of just like trying to avoid groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen groupthink operate to ill effect in past roles before on candidate review. So
yeah, I agree. That's so important. So when it comes to evaluating, right, we've sourced the candidates, they've applied, we've reviewed the applications, and now it's time to interview them. What are some tips and things that people can think about when they're building an inclusive interview process?
I think it's important to remember that, especially when interviewing someone for a technical position like an IC role, if they need to do some sort of technical evaluation, we always allow them to do it on their own time. Some people take longer when they're doing these things. We offer them the advice to time box it, but I don't love whiteboard exercises because it really puts people on the spot. And I think you can do a code review afterwards, which also gives you a good enough experience with what they've done technically. It's better to not put them on the spot. That's my experience. And then the flip side beyond the technical evaluation is also, one of Alexis or Ilse said this, but a values fit rather than a culture fit. I think culture fit really just means gut feel, and that's when all of the biases come in. So looking for specific values, like if you're looking for, an accountant who is going to be very cost efficient, there's a way of judging cost efficiency that isn't just like, maybe that's not a great example, but looking for a values fit as opposed to a culture fit, because you don't want everybody to think the same way and have the same cultural background, right? That's not diverse. So.
I think something that we have used to great effect are panel interviews. They do take we take extra care at the beginning to say, hey, we know this might be a little intimidating to have 3 people staring you down, asking you questions, but remember, it's just a conversation. But it helps us get like a singular snapshot of the same set of questions across multiple reviewers. And I found that has been really useful, because if someone has a bad day, it's everybody's similar perception of a bad day, but it makes for a bit, kind of having been on both sides, I think it's a better candidate experience. And again, it kind of gives us a more uniform reviewer experience.
yeah, another thing that we experimented with in the process and have adopted is we actually provide the interview questions, most of them up front, for anything that would benefit from some reflection from the candidate. What we don't want to be inadvertently screening for extroverts or charm or people who are comfortable in that environment over others. And we've found that actually sending the questions ahead of time makes our time together, the examples that they can provide are much pithier and more relevant, and they are also just more at ease. So that's been one thing that we've adopted.
I will say I went through a process myself where they gave me all the questions ahead of time and then they didn't ask them, which is really frustrating. So just make sure if you're going to do that, that you actually ask the questions. Because I spent all this time like on a spreadsheet and everything. So yeah.
That's
No,
super
but
important.
I do agree, like setting a candidate up for success and taking out the things that could potentially introduce bias or introduce nerves, do everything you can to make the candidate comfortable so that they can shine and really thrive in that process. I mean, that's what inclusion is all about, right? Putting everybody on the same
like what
playing
it will
field.
be like on the job as opposed to in a stressful situation, which hopefully there are few of on the job.
Yeah.
Another point, I think that another step we take at the take exercise step is we compensate them for their time. We send them a thank you afterwards. And the idea there is to be of people for whom childcare might be a barrier, or maybe they don't have the flexibility in time off from their job, or household support for the extra time that it takes for the technical exercise.
Yeah,
that's a great idea. I like that.
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about the technical exercise and it being take home and giving them as much time as they need and also paying them, which is great. But I know we talked when we chatted before, the technical exercise was a hot topic. Are there any other tips to make sure that it is inclusive for folks that maybe need a little bit more help, or they have some sort of disability or something of that sort? How would you make it inclusive for those folks?
One thing that we do that hasn't been said yet is we share ahead of time. I think Colleen said this, what our suggested time is. And we do try to think about and get feedback from folks on, is this actually a relevant amount of time? But we also share the rubric so people don't have to guess on what they will be judged on. And we think about, okay, did our test actually work out for folks once we get through the process? So we've looked at that a little bit. I think coming back again to that question of, is this actually reflective of the job skills, is another piece that we take into consideration. And sometimes it means, what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's a balance to get to the most concise set of questions. It still has the right amount of coverage. So it's a little bit of work up front, I think, compared to just saying, hey, why don't you send me a link to your GitHub or a project that you've done in the past? But it's having a consistent technical exercise across folks, again, is another way that we're able to help control for bias as best we can.
I like the idea of, I like the idea of sharing the rubric too. That's a great idea. Yep. Like we do that a little bit, but I think there's definitely room for improvement across the board. So.
Yeah, because sometimes we doubted ourselves before that at the evaluation stage. Oh, what if they just misinterpreted what we were looking for? Mm-hmm. So that eliminated that.
Yep. And going to your point on it being, you want to see how they would do on the job, you're usually given expectations when you're given a project. So why not share that with the technical exercise? Great. And now we talked a little bit about culture fit and values fit. How would you respond to an interviewer, somebody that was on the panel that came back to you and said, I just don't think they're a culture fit?
I mean, something that generic, I'd definitely be like, I'm going to need some details on that, because I think usually what comes down to culture fit is often communication or self-awareness. I think a lot of things come back to those two things. So, I think it kind of depends on what is meant by culture fit, so I think you need to dig into that, because I think a lot of the things that are culture fit are either bias or communication.
Yeah, I think because of the way that our questions and process are designed, people can usually point to a specific part of it. for folks who are new to the way that to Brooklyn Data and the way that we do our process, as they're like getting used to being interviews, we'll say, hey, here, this is how this works. We can point them to the place where we decided these are the questions that we should be looking for, and this is what they're mapping to. So we get less, we get fewer statements that are something just isn't right, and it tends to be more, I thought X was missing when they answered this question, or it seemed like they avoided this a little bit, and then we can take that into follow-up questions post-interview if needed. Would you
And
add anything else there, Ilse? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Colleen.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think Brooklyn Data, much like Starburst and a lot of other companies in the startup world, probably also have a very clearly articulated set of core values that are corporate values. So having that, you can definitely be like, okay, well, if it's culture fit, then it's not a mismatch with one of those core values necessarily. So that indicates that it might be more of a bias thing.
Yeah. So digging in a little bit further on the interviewers, right? How are you prepping your interviewers and making sure they are removing bias out of their evaluation?
Yeah, again, that clear scorecard that everyone shares, and going into the panel interview, this is the same for phone screen as well, but having all the questions scoped out ahead of time.
Yeah, like having the questions like actually written down, like you are going to be asking this, but I mean, trying not to make it formulaic, but understanding what the question is and what the desired outcome is from that question that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think for phone screens, as we're growing the number of people who participate in that, we just started adding shadowing. For panel interviews, we do a pretty good prep session ahead of time. For people who are reviewing technical exercises or our application questions, we usually chat a bit about how to go through it and some of the pitfalls that people tend to come across. So again, is it that you wouldn't do it this way, or that this isn't a technically sound way to solve a problem? Or to point out, just again, to make it seem conversational. So we, again, like you said, we outline it ahead of time, but it doesn't feel so formulaic in practice. It really is a nice chat, which is enjoyable, because at the end of the day, we're trying to bring like that human element to the process, which is seeing the whole person, and that's a big part of inclusion as well.
Yeah. And then when it comes to deciding who to hire, right? I think I mentioned at the beginning that bringing on a diverse team is definitely the harder way to do it. There's more work involved. There's more areas you need to look at. Do you have any kind of requirement or metric in terms of how many people you need to see and what the diversity of those folks need to be before you make a decision? To be more clear, is it if we see 4 people for final rounds, do 2 of them need to be diverse candidates?
We don't do it for final rounds. We do it for the initial sourcing though. And I mean, it's a fluid thing. So, you know, I think we're small enough that we don't have that kind of KPI yet, but we're definitely like looking into building that sort of thing out. And I've worked at places where they do have, and I know, you know, Microsoft and Google and Slack have all implemented KPIs around those things and OKRs. And I think it's a great idea, especially if you're scaling a company quickly. Like you have to have that in mind, because otherwise you're going to incur that diversity debt that nobody wants.
I want to push back on the assumption that it is a more difficult process to hire inclusively, because I think it's just like a slightly different process. Maybe the effort is just in changing your process from the current one to the new one, but I don't think it's inherently more difficult. That's my perspective.
Yeah.
I think the impression that it is difficult though comes from the fact that people are like, well, I'm just not getting like diverse resumes, right? I think that's where the challenge is. And I agree that it's a challenge that everybody should be up for and everybody should put that effort in. But I think, you know, the alternative being putting no thought into it. So, yeah.
Yeah, when you hear a lot of the misconceptions, takes longer than other methods, or we're lowering the bar, it's a pipeline problem. It's not the right time for the business, right? When you're incurring diversity debt, which is another flavor of we don't have time for that right now. Like those are all, and not necessarily coming from bad person in place, right? But a lack of awareness or thought that like it's not worthwhile to consider, or like why do we need to change? What happens if, you know, we could hire people and they'll work here and it will still be fine. But that's like, I mean, to paint a really big stroke, right? Like we don't necessarily get that across all different elements of culture and society. So it takes like that training the same way we have to learn to, you know, do our things in a technically sound way. We have to learn to do them the humanistic way, I suppose, for lack of a better word. Yeah, we talk about those things a lot when we're thinking about, are we doing the right thing, and like are we really like walking the walk, or are we just talking about it? So yeah, I mean, to the original question, we swapped it around also, as opposed to being at the end of the process. We just take a really targeted approach for posting, and I think we're still growing in this way, but also as a company, people at the company will say, wow, I reviewed a lot of candidates, and at the end, it was all white men. Like, what happened? That happened the first time, I think. Like, how did we get so many people that look the same? Like, people ask that question. And so I think as you start to gain momentum, it also builds and kind of getting that accountability as well.
Yep. I'd like to go down the, oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay.
I was just going to say, one other thing we do is post to more specialized boards and wait a couple weeks before posting more broadly.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think when you post it on your website or LinkedIn, that's when you're going to get more of the non-diverse folks, which is important. So going down the thread of misconceptions, Alexis, you were talking about the misconceptions. It takes longer. It's going to be harder to do those types of things. How have you responded to those when those do pop up? If we have folks listening that are getting that pushback right now, what would you recommend they say?
It's a good question. I mean, I think if they're starting from zero, like that no one else has thought about this at their company for some reason, or they feel like they're very, you know, isolated in perceiving this issue. If it's possible, I think saying, well, let me try this and let's see how that goes, right? At the worst case, it's just for that person's team. Worst case for the company, right? But best case, they're starting out something that the same way you'd handle change management for anything else, right? Like, let's start small and grow it. I think that's a great place to start. And I think the other side is if those people have the, what do you call that, sort of organizational capital, or they can align themselves with people who do, to speak that truth to people who say, well, we don't have that time, to ask them really why, like, where is that coming from? Because you can't dismantle it if you don't understand it. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the thing that I hear is, well, I just want to hire the best person. And, you know, my argument back to that is, well, if you really want to hire the best person, you need to look at a broad array of candidates, not just your buddies, right? And I would think the best for the company is also to hire more diverse people, because then you'll be more innovative, better able to handle complexity, you know, get better market fit, those sorts of things. And, you know, that's been shown time and again. So if people aren't on board with that, then, you know, you can show them why they need to get on board with that. But if you really want to hire the best candidates and do the best thing for your company, you need to look at people outside of the box that has already been defined.
I would also argue that by raising the bar, you get a more diverse team, because you're no longer indexing on like spurious signals like university, or like prestigious university or a prestigious company that someone worked on before, and getting those candidates into the process. Instead, you're really indexing on, does this person have the demonstrated skills for the job? And so by raising the bar, you end up with a more diverse candidate pool at the end.
And it was mentioned earlier, looking at someone's background is not necessarily have they done this, but can they do it? And when it comes to extending an offer, how do you make sure you're extending offers in an inclusive way when you're maybe looking at people who haven't done the job before?
I can say that we put the compensation up front in the job description. So the offer is there's no new information in the offer. There shouldn't be any surprises at that point. We want to reduce that kind of information asymmetry that puts people at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and I'd say, especially now that we've grown, it's going to decrease. But earlier on in our hiring, by the time someone's gotten through the hiring process, they probably had talked to most of the people at the company. But as we continue to grow, like, we have the option for people to reach out and, ask, like, hey, can I talk to someone who does X or does Y at the company? And we're fully distributed. Like, we've always been that way. So that people can't walk around and see, like, look for like affinity necessarily. So kind of making that space and being open in that way, I think, is really important as well.
So let's go down that thread a little bit.
Sure.
The remote piece. You guys you're fully distributed. Oh, most companies are fully remote right now, and there's not a lot of opportunity to walk around and be able to see the team, see folks sitting at their desk, and see what that diversity and that inclusion looks like. How do you show that as a company? And on the flip side, how do you test for that as a candidate?
I think showing it as a company, I mean, the clear answer to me is making sure you have a diverse interview panel, making sure that your panel is representative of who you are and who you want to be. And then on the candidate side, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of research you can do. Glassdoor just did a survey that 76% of job seekers really value D&I as a piece of a company's story. So most companies have a story these days, and the question is, are they living up to their ideals there, right? So doing your research, asking around, and making sure you're reading reviews on the company and seeing what groups they sponsor, that kind of thing, is really key.
And I think if you're very small or starting from a place of, we're not sure where to start or what people might ask, they're good if you search for questions to ask about diversity and inclusion at companies, like looking at that from the candidate's perspective. I also find that that's a good way. Like, at the end of the day, eventually you have to do the research, which just takes time to sort of build your knowledge of, how do I really care about all people, not just people who are like me. But those candidate question lists are a really great place to start on sort of broadening your perspective on places where the company is doing well and on what the company is still working on. And then you have that in the interview, because I find that candidates tend to come ready with those questions as well.
Yeah, it's a great tip. So if you had to pick one element from your hiring process that would be the most important part to be inclusive, which would it be?
I lean strongly on the rubric. That question, is this important for the job, and how is it important for the job? If you can answer that for the steps of your process and the questions that you ask, I think you're really well off.
Yeah. I think the other piece of it is, having hired a lot of people over the last few years, as a leader, it's really important to me that I make sure that there's pay equity and equity, making sure that, I like that, much like you all, I'm a data nerd. So 35% of employees who own shares are women, but they only hold 20% of the equity. So there's definitely a breakdown there. So I'm very clear as a hiring manager that within my organization, there's fair pay across the board and fair division of equity across the board. That's something that's really important to me. And I make sure that I work for a company that believes in that too. So.
In terms of principles, I think the focus on demonstrable skills is the most kind of overarching thing about the process. It's the most important, that over all the other signals that may or may not be true. And then as far as if I had to choose one element in our process to screen people on, it would be the technical exercise, because it's the best, it gives you the best sense of their actual work and simulates the on the job.
Yep. So as you're going through this process, what are some challenges and roadblocks that you've run into when you're trying to hire inclusively, and how have you navigated those?
I've often wanted to, I often have multiple people review resumes because there's a thing where, like, you know, you scan the resume, you're like, Java, Java, Java. Yep, they've got Java, right? But then there's, like, you know, there's all these other things that you're looking for. And you want to make sure that you're not wasting your time by talking to every candidate who might possibly fit your bill. And, you know, there's a lot of things that you see in resumes that may or may not be problematic. And so I think having a really good screening process is key. And it's hard to be inclusive, but not overly inclusive in your screening process. So being very clear about the things that you are looking for, and, you know, having a, you know, as a hiring manager, having a recruiting partner who understands how to look for that as well, so that, you know, you can divide and conquer and make sure that you're talking to a broad array of candidates, but also not wasting your time by talking to everyone because you want to be overly inclusive too. So, you know, because you need to be inclusive, but then also as a hiring manager, like, I need to fill this role and soon, right? At a startup, we got to move fast. So.
That just remind me, I don't know if we said this earlier, but we don't accept resumes in our process. If people submit them, People Ops removes them from the reviewer's view. So that is not one of our challenges, like sorting through that material. But I think one particular challenge, which I would love to see applicant tracking systems step up to, is making that anonymization process easy. Or if you want to turn off resumes, we actually can't hide, we use Lever, and we actually can't hide that resume box in the application. We just put a note above it, like, we don't look at them. So
How do you screen if you're not looking at resumes, though? That's
a
I mean,
great question. So just putting the questions, the specific questions about the specific things we want to know in that initial application.
Okay.
So like if it was Java, like, what is your experience level with Java, or how have you used Java to solve whatever business problem, whatever.
Yeah, I like that idea of how, so we don't have an application process, but I have worked at places that have, and that's an interesting idea that, like, you know, please don't give us your resume, just answer these questions, and then they're sort of self-screening.
Yeah, I think it makes a big difference in the amount of screening that we have to do, because I think the pool gets smaller at that point, more refined.
Sorry, go ahead. Alexis.
No, that's okay. I'm fine.
Sorry. So I guess this leads me to be curious. I'd love to hear what your process actually looks like. So once somebody applies and fills out those questions, what comes next?
So it's Kickstart questions, people internally review, someone does a phone screen. Sometimes there are follow-up questions from the Kickstart questions. So if we didn't get enough clarity, we might ask for that there as well. Then there's a technical exercise, panel interview. I forget if we have changed this order recently, Ilse, so correct me if I'm wrong. We have a founder chat and we call references when it gets down to that point. So it sounds like a lot of steps. It's not so bad. I mean,
it isn't much like candidate time overall.
Yeah, I think my biggest challenge that I'd point out is time and limited resources, like going back to your last question. So every time we think about kind of where does the process stand and what's working well or what should we change, there's that element of how do we keep candidates from having to do too much, and also how do we make sure that reviewers' time is well spent. And so that's like a part of why our technical exercise is before a panel interview, because they have different levels of time investment required.
And the only thing I'll add there is that we also write out the screening process on the job posting so that people know what to expect.
Yeah, ours is somewhat similar. It depends on the job description. I mean, the job as well. Like, a manager is obviously different than an IC, but, you know, we do the recruiter or hiring manager screen up front, and then technical, and then usually like a systems design and problem solving interviews for ICs, and then there's a decision. So we're very authentic and thoughtful about the questions that are asked as well.
Have you found references to be useful in your process?
Depends. Yeah, it depends on the situation. Like often we'll feel that we got enough information from the person, and you can look through their Git or something similar where you can get a good feel for what they do. But if there's open questions and we're like, we're pretty sure we want to hire them, but we just want to double check this one thing, then we'll ask for a reference.
Another thing I think to mention, because I've seen it done other ways, is that we have a decision point at each step in the process. We don't put all the candidates through all the steps. So as soon as they don't pass the threshold on any step, they don't advance. And that
we've
reviewer time.
Yeah, we've done both. I've done both ways, and I mean, it was obviously more challenging when a person was physically in a building too, to be like, you know what, you don't need to do the next 3 things, but you also don't want to waste people's time. So there's always that balance there too. But yeah, we typically either schedule 1 or 2 things at a time and then keep moving them forward. That way, you're not wasting people's time, but you're also giving them a chance to, if they did have a bad interview for whatever reason, I mean, you never know what's going on in someone's life. And so giving them another chance is always good too.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You actually made me think of something that I really appreciate about our process, because we have people give written reviews for each step of the process. If people ask for why they didn't make it, it makes it a little bit easier to say, hey, this is what the reviewer said. So then we can get calibration from that too, because they say, well, the reviewer said this, but I actually didn't see it. I didn't see that specified in what you wrote up. So then it gives us even more of a feedback loop, which is really nice.
That's a great point. A lot of candidates, and it reflects well on them. They ask for feedback, and I always oblige with a live 15-minute chat with them. And it's so helpful to have everyone's written feedback to kind of synthesize for them and talk over.
Oh yeah, I definitely believe in like the feedback step. Like, what if we're not going to hire someone? I'm always interested in giving them very specific feedback. Like, we were looking for X. It seems like you're more interested in Y. Just because I don't want it to be. I want it, if we can't clearly articulate why we're not hiring someone, that's a sign that our process is not good. So
also, there are people that I hope we get to hire in a future round as their skills improve, and so I love to give feedback for that reason.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about outcomes. How do you know you've built an effective process that is inclusive? How do you know that that's worked?
I mean, I think the answer that comes to mind right away is that you end up with a diverse workforce. You end up with people from all sorts of backgrounds and different life experiences succeeding through your process, and you don't end up with like a very homogenous workforce. And so that's obviously a slow play, but I think that's the ultimate answer in my mind.
Yeah, and I imagine, and maybe it's just because we're a little over 2 years old as a company, but it feels like more of a process than a destination as well. It's like, okay, we are seeing people get all the way through the process. Are they successful post-process? And over time, has that process continued to serve us, or are there ways it can get better? Because I think we have a pretty inclusive process as a company, but I mean, we have quite the list of this is what we'd like to do next, like as we keep refining that. So.
Yeah, and I think you both, but the only other thing I would add is then like retention, not just success in the job, but then what does the retention of the team members look like?
I'm just laughing because your company's 2 years old, mine's 3 years old. So, retention,
right, 100%,
long-term success. Yeah.
So Alexis, you just mentioned there's a list of things you'd like to do to improve it. If you could change one thing, what would it be right now? What would you like to implement to make your process more inclusive?
The one thing, yes, the one thing out of the whole list. There's more than one. I don't know if I could pick the one thing. A small thing is that there is one platform that I know about right now that automatically does all of the anonymization and makes it much smoother and easier. And like software seems like a little thing, but if it that's like that micro savings that makes our process that much faster, which is better turnaround for the people we hire and for us. So I think if I could pick a small thing, that's probably it right now.
Yeah, I had the same thing in mind, but I'd love to do more kind of systematically surveying. We do some surveys of candidates that have been through our process, but I'd like to have that more consistent and get more ideas through them.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, that like having the post process for both people who didn't succeed through the process and people who did, like having the ability to accept feedback on that or to solicit feedback, actually doing it actively so that we could actively like look at that and be like, oh, this person thought the process was potentially unfair because of, you know, A, B, C, D. So
yeah, absolutely. So we talked a lot about the hiring process, and hopefully we've given everybody who's listening in some ideas to implement into their processes and continue to create diverse teams. But I think it's really important to note that the conversation doesn't end here. Hiring is just the beginning, right? There's a whole career ahead of these folks, hopefully with your company. So to wrap, we have about 5 minutes left. I would love to talk about what comes next and how you keep diversity and inclusion top of mind when it comes to promotions, assigning projects, pay equity as they continue to grow within the organization. I'd love some tips and tricks there.
Yeah, I think a lot about these things because I think inclusive culture is so important. I mean, it's not enough to just have a diverse workforce. It's important to have that inclusive culture so everyone can do their best work and thrive equally. And it has nothing to do with where you came from and what you look like, right? So I do think that pay equity, and you know, I think that's very important. I also think promoting fairly and providing training is key. You know, 87% of managers wish they had more training, and a lot of managers don't have training. So I think that's, you know, a quick win. It's providing training for a lot of people, but also promoting fairly and making sure that, you know, you are inclusive at all levels and that you are diverse at all levels, not just the entry level, is very important because that's where we tend to see more homogeneity is at the higher levels.
I think you won't be surprised to hear me say the career version of the rubric, which is a progression framework, right? And that's probably, if you said, what's the next thing for inclusive culture, for us, that would be like that and hiring more entry-level people, because that's the other side of what we can do to keep fostering better practices in our industry. But yeah, people having something they can point to and understand clearly, this is what it means to be successful in the job. And I know that everyone is being judged that way. And if I feel like I'm not getting enough experience here, I can ask about it. And I know my manager is also looking at this going, am I making sure that they're getting judged that way or getting the opportunity to be able to have those experiences? It's a really helpful tool across so many ways.
Yeah, I will also echo the pay equity call there. So I think having as much like benchmarking to a third party data source there and having consistent pay across roles and visibility into that is really helpful.
Yeah, not surprising that the three of us are all like, the data should show everything. Yeah, rubric, the data.
Oh, go ahead, Ilse, sorry.
No, I was gonna say also the algorithm. For international pay, we have like an equation. We got this from Buffer, like adjusting based on ratio, based on cost of living in other locations. And so, yeah, the equations too.
You mentioned you did that internationally. Do you do that domestically as well, or do you pay the same within the US?
We decided to pay based on 65th percentile of nationwide salaries. So, yeah. And not get into, you know, where people by moving locations would need to have a salary adjustment.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we are about at time. So what I'd love to do is say first a huge thank you to Ilse, Alexis, and Colleen. This was a fantastic chat, and I really hope that folks listening got some key takeaways and things that they can go back and implement right away to make their process much more inclusive.
Thanks, Meg. Nice chatting with you all.
Thanks.